Before we begin, a warning that this episode contains descriptions of sexual violence that some listeners could find upsetting. You can find information on helplines in the episode description and at the end of this episode. A group of divers put on their wetsuits and entered the icy waters of Lough Ina in County Galway. Some of them are Gardaí, some are volunteers, some are just college students. The water is dark. Silt from the boggy bed of the lake turns it a dense black. It is like swimming in mud. That darkness conceals all that lies beneath the surface. They sink to the bottom of the lake, down deep. The divers push a metal bar along the bed of the lake. Inch by inch they go, from one side of the lake to the other, and then back again. The water is so dark they cannot see. They search by hand, reaching out blindly, terrified of what they might find. The memories of this time will never leave them. If they find something, they are to bang on the metal bar to alert the rest of the team. They are almost 2 weeks into their search. Every day in that cold water, every day with that fear. And still nothing. They are losing hope. They are exhausted. Their bodies can't take much more, and their minds are close to breaking point. The sound of the metal bar rings out, and they stop and wait for the black silt to clear, to see if their search is at last over. When someone is murdered in Ireland, the Gardaí call in a team of forensic scenes of crime examiners from the Technical Bureau. And for 25 years, I was a part of that team. My name is John Sweetman. I was there to help read the silent and often hidden clues at a crime scene. I saw what killers tried to hide, fingerprints unknowingly left behind, murder weapons hidden in plain sight, handwriting that betrayed a lie. Every detail told the real story. And now, I'll tell you those stories. In this podcast from GoLoud, I take you inside some of Ireland's most haunting crimes. This is Lines of Enquiry, a GoLoud original podcast that looks beyond the headlines, following the evidence step by step and uncovering the stories behind the investigations. In this episode, the story of Elizabeth Plunkett and Mary Duffy, the shocking, horrific crimes against them, and the lasting pain left by Ireland's first serial killers. The Irish summer of 1976 was not normal. The country scorched and shimmered in a record-breaking heatwave. The temperatures passed 30 degrees, and a historic drought saw water supplies dwindle and reservoirs run dry. The country ran short on beer and stocked up on electric fans. People were buying Mediterranean-style shutters for their windows. It was the kind of heat that changed the way people lived. The kind of summer you might remember forever. Elizabeth Plunkett was 23 years old in those months. She was from Ringsend, a working-class area on the edge of Dublin city. It sits alongside the city's port, and it's a place where history is important. Community means everything. The locals call it Raytown, in honour of its fishing heritage and the rayfish that sustained generations of their families. Elizabeth grew up on a street called Pembroke Cottages, a narrow row of single-storey homes that runs right up to the shore, where the River Liffey meets the Irish Sea. When Elizabeth walked to the end of that small street, the world opened up before her, as ships from across the globe passed just metres from her front door. Her parents, Kathleen and Tommy Plunkett, raised 8 children in a small 2-bedroom cottage. The girls shared one room and the boys the other, while the parents slept on a pull-out bed in the living room. It was a cramped existence, but one filled with love and fun. Kathleen Plunkett could be found dancing and singing around the kitchen and would tell everyone that she should have been a film star. In late August, even the sea winds couldn't hold back the relentless heat. It was a good time to head for the countryside, and Elizabeth loved to venture into the outdoors. She liked to hike, camp and swim. On the morning of Saturday, August 28, with the summer nearing its end, Elizabeth and some friends made a trip south to Brittas Bay, a popular seaside town in County Wicklow. She went with her boyfriend, Damien Bush, and 5 other friends. The 7 of them made the drive of an hour or so to Staunton's Caravan Park. One of the 7 was Mella Bush, Damien's sister. Elizabeth and Mella worked together in the Delarue printing firm. Elizabeth was a currency clerk and had worked there since she was 16. Mella had introduced Elizabeth and Damien, and while it had only been a 5-month relationship, they were mad about each other. A mechanic by trade, Damien drove a Ford Capri, a fairly cool sports car for the time. He would often pick her up for a spin, blasting ABBA as they went. When she knew Damien was calling to the house, Elizabeth would make sure the place was spotless. She'd pay her younger sisters to polish the brass, and she'd argue with her father that there was no good reason her brothers couldn't clean up the dishes. Elizabeth was born into an Ireland with set roles for men and women, but she didn't have much time for old ways of thinking. She was a strong young woman. She was adventurous and confident. She loved to travel, she loved to dress well, and she loved music. She had a locked suitcase under her bed at home, filled with her record collection. That Saturday morning, Elizabeth's mother and aunt stood on the street in Ringsend Village, congratulating a newly married couple emerging from a local church. Around the corner, Damien pulled up outside the Plunkett family cottage to collect Elizabeth. As they left Ringsend, they passed Elizabeth's mother. Damien beeped a horn and she waved them off on their adventure. For Kathleen Plunkett, that moment would stay with her forever. When Damien and Elizabeth arrived at the caravan park in Brittas Bay with their 5 friends, they decided to drop into the nearby pub, McDaniel's. There was a dance on that weekend in the local hotel, and between that and the crowds arriving from Dublin to cool off by the sea, McDaniel's was heaving, with hundreds of people crammed in. Elizabeth was wearing white trousers and a navy top with Saint-Tropez across its front, a souvenir from a holiday to the French town. On her wrist, she wore a silver Seiko watch, a gift from her father for her 21st birthday. They got drinks and found seats upstairs. Elizabeth and Damien stayed standing, along with Damien's friend Joe McCoy. Damien and Joe had previously bought a car together, which Damien had sold without telling Joe. Joe let him know he wasn't happy. The argument over the car went on and on. Elizabeth listened to the pair going back and forth. Eventually, she had enough. She told them they were there to enjoy themselves, not argue over a sold car. She said, to hell with the car until Monday. An hour later, Damien and Joe were still going. Elizabeth tried again to end it, but Damien put his finger on her left cheek, telling her, "Go away and don't be annoying me." She told him if he did that again, she'd go home. "Go home then," he said. And so Elizabeth left. Mella Bush considered following her friend out of the pub, but she didn't. In that brief moment, she worried Elizabeth was already embarrassed by how Damien had dismissed her, and would only be more embarrassed to be followed out of the pub. And so Elizabeth left alone. For Damien and Mella, that moment would stay with them forever. Around 11 p.m. that night, a woman named Mary Green sat in her parked car with her husband outside McDaniel's. Their son worked in the pub, and they were waiting for him to finish his shift. Mary Ann saw a young woman leaving. She had brown hair and wore white trousers and a top with Saint-Tropez on it. The woman passed Mary Ann's car and walked on. 5 minutes later, Damien and Joe went outside McDaniel's to peacefully resolve their row. They leaned against Damien's car and made amends. A few minutes later, they left the warm summer night and returned to the busy pub. When they did, they went looking for Elizabeth, but they found no sign of her. They asked Mella if she had seen her. She hadn't. Damien asked his sister to check if Elizabeth was in the women's toilets. She wasn't. The group left the pub to look for her. Damien, Mella and the rest of their friends stood outside McDaniel's, calling into the night. There was no answer. They decided to head back to the caravan, hoping to find Elizabeth there. As they walked the 2 miles of dark road, they called Elizabeth's name into the quiet night. At roughly 11:20 p.m, a man named David James MacDonald was driving not far from McDaniel's pub with a friend. He saw a young woman walking along the road towards them. She was wearing white trousers and a navy jumper. She was looking down. As they passed, it looked like she raised her hand to block the glare of the headlights from her eyes. David drove on, but he soon turned back. He saw her again. She was walking slowly, but not stumbling, not drunk. He continued driving, passing her again. As he did, he saw a small grey car driving slowly in the opposite direction. He looked in his rearview mirror and saw the car stop beside the woman. Something about it felt off. A few minutes later, he and his friend pulled in at a shop down the road. David wondered if they should turn back. His friend told him he should stay out of it. And so they didn't go back. Elizabeth's friends arrived at the caravan, hoping to find her there. She wasn't. They searched the entire caravan park, but still no sign. 2 of the group drove around searching roads and nearby towns. Eventually, they returned to the caravan and tried to sleep. Shortly before 1 a.m. on the morning of Sunday, the 29th of August, almost 2 hours after Elizabeth had started her walk from McDaniel's pub, Mary Ann Green and her husband left the pub car park with their son, who had finished his work for the night. As they drove home, they passed Castletimon Woods, about 1 mile up the road. Mary Ann looked out of the window, into an opening leading into the woods. She saw a parked grey car, facing away from the road. The lights inside the car were on. A few hours later, in the early hours of that Sunday morning, a grey car drove into the car park of Jack White's pub, a few miles from Castletimon Woods. A man got out of the car and walked away, back in the direction he had come from, back to the woods. In Elizabeth's home in Ringsend that night, the Plunkett family slept. In the kitchen, a bowl of marrowfat peas were soaking, softening up for dinner the next day. Elizabeth's mother and younger sister, both of them called Kathleen, woke on Sunday morning and began their routine of peeling potatoes and preparing the meat for a roast dinner. They sliced apples and rolled out pastry for apple tarts. Moments of routine that would never be the same after that day. A short while later, 14-year-old Kathleen dusted flour from her hands to answer a knock at the door. A friend of Elizabeth stood there. She asked if Elizabeth was home. Kathleen said her sister was in Brittas for the weekend. When she came back to the kitchen, her mother found it strange Elizabeth's friend wouldn't know she was away. She went to follow the girl, but she had already hopped back into a car at the end of the street and driven off. The woman who knocked at the door was Antoinette McLaughlin, one of the group who had travelled with Elizabeth to Brittas Bay. She returned to the car and told their friends Elizabeth wasn't home. Damien's anxiety grew. They had already called into Elizabeth's sister Joan, but realising how serious the situation was, he went back to ask her to come with him to the family home in Ringsend. Around 1:45 p.m. that Sunday afternoon, a man was seen sleeping in a grey car in the car park of Jack White's pub. A short while later he woke and asked someone nearby for help getting his car started. The man had an English accent. With a push from the passer-by, he drove off, heading in the direction of Castletimon Woods. That evening, Elizabeth's sister, Kathleen, had gone to the local disco. When she got home, the house was full and the atmosphere was tense. Her family told her Elizabeth was missing. Their mother couldn't understand how her confident and independent daughter, who had travelled to France and Romania, who was well able to look after herself, wouldn't be able to find her way home from Wicklow, an hour up the road. She felt a terrifying and heartbreaking thought emerge. She said to the others, "My Elizabeth is dead. Otherwise she'd be here, I'm telling you." Elizabeth's father, Tommy, sent his daughter Bernie and Elizabeth's boyfriend Damien to the local Garda station. The guard they spoke to said there wasn't much they could do at that stage because Elizabeth was over 21 and hadn't been missing for a full 24 hours. No one in the Plunkett house slept that night. After midnight that same night, about 24 hours after Elizabeth was last seen, two men in a grey car drove past McDaniel's pub. They pulled up at the seafront and approached a small rowboat. They broke the padlock on the boat. They lifted something heavy into it. Then they left the boat and headed into the caravan park nearby, peering in windows. They took a length of rope from a clothesline. Then they spotted a shed. From inside the shed, they took oars and a small lawnmower. Returning to the boat with the rope, oars and lawnmower, they rowed out to sea. A short while later, the two men rowed back to shore. A few hours later, at dawn on Monday the 30th of August, the Plunkett family travelled to Brittas Bay to search for their daughter and sister. Two of Elizabeth's brothers, who had been working as fishermen in Cork, met them there. The fine spell of weather had broken. The long, hot summer had ended. It was raining as the Plunketts began their search. They walked through the powder sand of the dunes and asked about her in McDaniel's pub. They drove up and down the small rural roads, looking for any trace of her. There was no sign, no clue, nothing to offer a shred of comfort, only a deepening fear. That same morning, the owner of a caravan park near McDaniel's pub spotted two men sitting at a patch of wasteland on the site. One was dark-haired, tall and well-built. The other had fair hair and was smaller. They looked like they hadn't shaved for a few days. The owner told them they were trespassing. As he did, one of the men kept his face turned away the entire time. The owner called local Gardaí to report the two men. Local Garda, Nicky Crennan, responded to the report, along with a colleague. They found the men sitting by a fire. There was something burning, and the men said it was rubbish. They were drying clothes by the fire. They said they had got wet in the rain. They said they were from Tipperary and in Wicklow on a holiday. They said they were brothers, John and Geoffrey Murphy. The men didn't look like brothers, and one of the Gardaí mentioned it. The men then said they were step-brothers. They spoke with English accents. Garda Nicky Crennan wrote down the two names on the back of an envelope and placed it in his pocket and told them to move on. He also noted down the registration plate of their car, a grey Austin. At that time, there was no official report that Elizabeth Plunkett was missing. That Monday, as the Plunkett family travelled to Brittas Bay to start their search, two children, Una Whelan and her brother Kevin, were playing in Castletimon Woods. The woods where Mary Ann Green had seen a car parked shortly after Elizabeth disappeared. As they walked through the woods, they spotted a pair of black men's boots. They were high, with a zip on the side. Kevin put them on and walked around, before leaving them back where they found them. In the coming days, Elizabeth was officially considered a missing person. Gardaí commenced a large search, and the Plunkett family were joined by neighbours, friends, colleagues, and the civil defence. They covered the beach, dunes, fields and laneways. Gardaí walked in lines through the tall grass, hacking away at the stalks and briars as they searched for any trace of Elizabeth. On September 4th, 6 days after she went missing, that first trace showed up. It was Joe McCoy, the friend Damien had been arguing with the night Elizabeth went missing, who found the first sign. As he searched an overgrown laneway leading to a quarry just 100 metres or so from the road, he spotted something. There, hanging from a briar, he saw a scarf and a bra. Then they found the next clue. A single shoe, lying 10 feet from the road, in Castletimon Woods, just 1 mile from McDaniel's pub. Annette and Mella recognised it. One of the wedged sandals Elizabeth wore the night she disappeared. When Gardaí inspected the shoes, they noticed scrape marks on the heels. Muck was pressed into the fresh grooves, as if Elizabeth had been dragged across the ground. Gardaí could see whoever had left the clothes hadn't made any attempt to hide them. They had thrown them away. A team began to search the quarry close to where Elizabeth's clothes had been found. But as they did, a Garda spokesperson told a reporter, "We have to admit we fear the worst." At some point over the next few days, a friend of the Plunketts was searching a laneway that led into Castletimon Woods. At around 3:30 p.m, he spotted something on the right-hand side. A pair of black men's boots with steel tips on the heel, standing tall in the grass. The boots that the children had played with a few days previously. Then they found what would prove to be a critical clue. It was a piece of cardboard with a hole through it. A homemade luggage tag. Written on this piece of cardboard was a name. Geoffrey Murphy. One local Garda recognised the name. Garda Nicky Crennan, who had met those two men sitting by the fire in the dump. The men who had claimed they were brothers but looked nothing alike. Geoffrey Murphy, the name he had written on an envelope, and beside the name was the registration plate number for a grey Austin A40. The Gardaí traced the car to Fethard, County Tipperary, and to the home of a man named Cliff Outram. On the 13th of September, a detective arrived at Cliff Outram's home. Outram told the detective that 2 friends of his, who he had met in prison, had borrowed the car. They had returned it a few days earlier, shortly before he dropped them to Limerick train station. The detective had brought with him the black boots found in the grass of Castletimon Woods. When Outram saw the boots, he asked the detective, "Where did you find Geoffrey's boots?" Soon after, a Garda from Dublin travelled to Wicklow with a picture of the 2 men Cliff Outram had loaned his car to. The Garda member showed the picture to Garda Nicky Crennan and asked him if these were the men he had seen at the fire. They were. Those men were John Shaw and Geoffrey Evans. Both were already wanted in Ireland and the UK for serious crimes, including multiple rapes of young women. The Gardaí at last had suspects, but they had no clue where the men were, where they would go next, or where Elizabeth was. The search for Elizabeth would continue, moving to the sand dunes on the beach and into the bay. But before the searchers left the woods, they made another discovery. A silver watch. Elizabeth's Seiko watch. The one her father had given her for her 21st birthday. On the 19th of September 1976, in the small village of Belcarra, County Mayo, 23-year-old Mary Duffy arrived home to the family farm in Deer Park after Mass. Mary brought home with her a copy of the Sunday Independent newspaper. In the kitchen, Mary's mother, Margaret, and her younger sister, Anne, prepared the family's breakfast. Mary sat down at the table next to her father, John, and began to read. Across the front page was the headline, "Missing Girl, Britons Sought." The article reported on the search for missing Elizabeth Plunkett. Elizabeth had been missing for 3 weeks. Mary read about the ongoing search, with an Air Corps helicopter and a team of divers involved. The article told of the Garda hunt for 2 English men who were wanted in relation to it. These men were aged 29 and 33, one dark-haired, one fair-haired. Together, they had over 30 previous convictions in Ireland and the UK, including for rape and other sexual offences. Their names were John Shaw and Geoffrey Evans. They had been seen in Brittas Bay the night Elizabeth disappeared and had already served brief jail time here in 1975 for 16 counts of burglary. That August, British police had issued an extradition warrant for the men. They had questions about 3 rape cases, but Evans and Shaw were released on a bond of £40 and given a month to prepare a case as to why they should not be extradited. They had failed to show up to that court hearing in Dublin. Gardaí said they were sure the men were still in Ireland and they wanted to speak to them about the disappearance of Elizabeth Plunkett. Mary Duffy had left school aged 13, and by the age of 23 she worked 2 jobs, as a shop assistant during the day 4 days a week and in the evenings as a cook at a restaurant in Castlebar, about 5 miles from her home. She had dreams of saving up enough money to emigrate to the United States. Her hometown of Belcarra was small. Some classes in the primary school could have as few as 6 pupils. She was the 4th eldest of the family, right in the middle, with 3 brothers and 3 sisters. Mary was a bit shy and quiet, and she was kind. She often spent the earnings from her jobs buying things for her younger sister, Anne. She was a character. She once caught a baby frog in a hayfield near their home, and decided the thing to do with it was to drop it down the back of Anne's top. As Mary finished reading about the missing girl Elizabeth in Wicklow, she tilted the page towards her father. With tears in her eyes, she said to him, "Isn't that awful?" By then, the Plunkett family in Dublin had waited 3 weeks for any kind of news. Their home was constantly filled with everyone from local priests to Garda detectives coming and going. The detectives came in and took away Elizabeth's belongings. Her younger sisters watched in fear as they came into their room and took away Elizabeth's things, her clothes and handbags, even her bedsheets. The press called in too. Elizabeth's mother Kathleen welcomed them in and made them tea. That trust was betrayed when one reporter stole pictures of Elizabeth from the home, and those private pictures later turned up in the papers, including one of Elizabeth in a bikini. The sense of betrayal was so grave that the family vowed to never again speak to the media. That would hold firm until almost 50 years later, when they would tell their story to RTE for a podcast called Stolen Sister. While the country waited for news about Elizabeth, a number of other incidents went unreported. In August and September of 1976, multiple women were pursued or fought off abduction attempts by 2 men in a car. In late August, 2 girls in a caravan park in County Wicklow, near Brittas Bay, heard a van pull up outside their caravan late one night. 2 men banged on the door. The men said they wanted to come in for tea. The girls told them they had no tea. The men said they would go to get tea and biscuits and come back. They returned later, circling the caravan and shouting that they wanted to come in. The young girl's aunts shouted out from the caravan and the 2 men fled. In Blackrock, South County Dublin, not far from Brittas Bay, a young mother waited at a bus stop. A car passed her, stopped and came back. Two men inside told the woman to get in and they would give her a lift. Something told her it didn't feel right. She said no. In County Cavan, a car pulled up beside a group of young girls. Two men jumped from the car and attempted to force the girls into it. The girls fought back and screamed, then ran. As the month of September moved on, these incidents moved west, including the County Mayo, Mary Duffy's home. On a Saturday night, two 17-year-old girls were at a dance in the town of Cong, County Mayo. They went to a chip van and a car pulled in behind them. Two men sat inside it. The girls bought their chips and left. The men followed them slowly in their car. The girls ran and jumped over a wall of a friend's garden, crouching behind it. They heard the car stop and the men getting out. The girls could hear the men looking for them. They had English accents. The men searched for the girls for several minutes before leaving. Near the Galway town of Oranmore, a young woman was hitching a lift. She was picked up by two men, both with English accents. As she sat in the car with them, she began to feel scared. She convinced the men to stop the car so she could go to the toilet in a pub. She went inside and escaped through the back of the pub. In the early hours of Monday morning, September 20th, a 20-year-old woman was driving on the outskirts of Galway City. As she turned a corner, she saw a green car in the middle of the road. There were two men in it. She went to pass and the car began chasing her. The driver tried to force her off the road. She kept driving, heading for the home of a relative nearby. As she arrived at the house, the car pulled in too. The passenger in the car got out and started to approach her. She leapt out of her car and the man stared at her silently. She walked backwards towards the house. She asked him what he wanted. He looked at her and said, "You." She ran to the front door, fumbling with her keys. She got inside and fainted. The next day, she reported the incident to Gardaí. The Gardaí gave out to her for not getting the car's number plate, and they asked her what she was doing driving on her own at that hour of the morning. For decades, none of these people would hear the stories of the others. Many of their stories were not known until 2025, when they contacted the makers of that RTE podcast series the Plunkett family had participated in. At the end of Mam Bridge in Connemara, County Galway, sits Kane's Pub. It's a remote place, with no neighbours within sight. It sits in isolation there at the side of Bailnabrack River. By the standards of rural Irish pubs, it's an elegant building. It looks more like a stately home than a pub, with stone columns framing its face and its tall windows looking back across the bridge. In 1976, the owner, Joe Kane, operated a petrol pump outside the pub. On Wednesday, September 22nd, just 3 days after Mary Duffy read the newspaper article at the kitchen table, a car pulled up outside Kane's at that petrol pump. It was a Ford Cortina with a roof rack and a broken rear light. Joe Kane spoke to the two men in the car. It had a Dublin registration plate, so he was surprised to hear their English accents. He then noticed something unusual about the car. It had a very peculiar look. It had been painted or repainted. It had once been green but was now black. It had been repainted seemingly by hand and done very roughly. The new paint job was obvious and not quite complete. To Joe, something about the car and the two men inside it seemed off. That evening, Mary Duffy finished her shift in the restaurant around 11 p.m. She left work dressed in a red top, jeans, a red duffel coat and boots. She wore 2 gold rings and carried a brown plastic handbag. Inside that was a red purse with white rosary beads, and a plastic cosmetics bag. In that smaller bag she had mascara and eyeshadow. Mary never walked all the way home after working a night shift. Instead, she would get a lift, either from a customer at the restaurant or her brother. Occasionally she might stay overnight with friends in Castlebar. That night, she borrowed some coins from a colleague to use a payphone to call her brother Michael, who worked nearby. Mary walked from work along the narrow paths of Castlebar on that quiet night, heading towards the payphone. She strolled across the open green space of the mall at the town centre and on through the streets snaking up the hill. It was around 10 minutes past 11 when she reached the phone box at the top of MacHale Road. She got through to her brother's workplace and asked to speak to Michael. He was out, they told her, but he would be back any minute. Mary asked him to let him know she would start walking and he could meet her at the junction of Brafey Road, just on the edge of town. Not long after Mary finished the call, she walked along Brafey Road. The road was lit up with street lamps and had houses on either side. The sudden sound of screams drew people in those homes to their windows and doors. One woman heard 2 screams, and a man's voice shouting, "Come on," as if he was calling to someone else. She looked out her window but couldn't see anything. A neighbour of hers also heard a woman screaming, as though she had been hurt. Another heard screams and looked out from their window, where they saw a car, a Ford Cortina, revving loudly. They noticed it had a broken taillight and a roof rack. The car sped off and the screaming stopped. Brafey Road was silent again. At 11:55 p.m, Michael arrived at the Brafey Road junction where Mary had said she would meet him. His sister wasn't there. He drove around Castlebar looking for her, knowing that she wouldn't have walked home. He assumed she had stayed the night with a friend in Castlebar. It was the following evening when Mary's family realised something was wrong. She hadn't been at work that day and hadn't made contact. They couldn't find her anywhere, and so that night they reported her missing to Gardaí. As Gardaí heard witnesses describe what they had seen and heard on Brafey Road that night, it wasn't long before they began fearing Mary Duffy may have crossed paths with the same people responsible for the disappearance of Elizabeth Plunkett. Castlebar and the local area was gripped by shock. The editor of the Connacht Telegraph, a local newspaper, described this time as the blackest week in living memory in County Mayo. Dozens of Gardaí, supported by locals, began a search for Mary. They searched the fields and woods near Castlebar and the 5-mile road between the town and her family home. There was no sign. There was only one trace of her ever being there: the dental plate Mary wore to replace a missing tooth, which was found lying on the road. Like Elizabeth Plunkett, she had been there one moment and gone the very next. The following day, in Connemara, Joe Kane heard a news report about the abduction of a young woman in Castlebar. Witnesses had seen a car with a broken taillight and a roof rack, just like the strange car that had stopped outside his pub the day before, with its peculiar paint job. He called the local Garda station to tell them what he had seen. As he described the 2 men, Gardaí were sure he had met John Shaw and Jeffrey Evans, just hours before they abducted Mary Duffy. And Joe Kane was able to give them something more, something that could prove critical. Before they left his petrol pump that day, Joe had written down the car's registration plate number: SZH562. Gardaí now had the model of a car, a detailed description of it, and perhaps most crucially, the registration plate number. Time was running short, but there was possibly at least a faint sign of hope. Everything about Connemara feels wild. That vast wilderness west of Galway City saturates the senses. A colossal sky stretches across mountains, lakes and valleys, and over the rock-filled fields and dense bogs. In early autumn, the land is a collage of vivid colour, with foxgloves, fuchsia and rhododendrons blooming in rich hues of purple, orange and pink, and they sit on the grey mountain faces in a perfect pairing, complementary in every way. It is beautiful, immense and wild as Ireland gets. That beauty is matched by a deep sense of isolation. You could wander the winding roads for miles and many hours, and you might never meet another soul. Two mountain ranges dominate the Connemara skyline, the 12 Bens and the Mam Turks, with a deep valley separating the two. At the bottom of this valley sits a lake, Lough Ina. Lough Ina is a freshwater lake. Thin lines of rushes stand watch along the shore, trembling on the wind. Beyond them, just back from the water's edge, a wall of wide and dark pine trees loom, and then the mountains that cradle the lake, rising to the sky. It's a place where silence can say more than mind can process. But that beauty doesn't reach every part of it. The water of Lough Ina is black. It's a dense black. The lake is stained by the bog that lies at its bed. There is almost no visibility underwater, only a murky, thick darkness hiding what lies beneath the surface. As you travel the winding road around Lough Ina, you find a small gravel track falling away from the road, down towards the water's edge. It leads to a stone boathouse, a single-storey building in the same shade of grey as the mountains around it. It's hemmed in by those tall pine trees and sits there staring out across the lake. In 1976, people fishing the deep waters of the lake would set out from the boathouse, and when they returned they would tie their small boats to the wooden jetties that poked from the shore. By late September, fishing season was coming to an end. On the night of Thursday, September 23rd, one day after the disappearance of Mary Duffy, the lake and the boathouse were deserted and silent. That silence was broken by the sound of shattering glass. A rock smashed through the window of the boathouse before landing on the floor inside. A man entered the dark room. He took a sledgehammer, a grappling hook and a pair of oars. He walked outside to the pier, where another man waited for him. The second man carried a concrete block and a length of rope. The men untied a boat from the pier and rowed out into Lough Ina, on its deep black waters. By Sunday, September 26th, Mary had been missing for 4 days. Elizabeth hadn't been seen in almost a full month. Gardaí knew time was critical if they were to have any hope of finding either girl alive, or to prevent their abductors finding a third victim. That night, around 8 p.m, 2 Gardaí were beginning their shift in Salt Hill, a beachside area of Galway City. They were about 65 kilometres from Lough Ina. Gardaí Jim Boland and PJ Corcoran discussed the car every Garda in Ireland was watching out for. The car driven by the 2 men who'd stopped at Joe Kane's petrol pump, and the car with the rough repainting job. PJ and Jim decided to make sure that the wanted men weren't in their sub-district. They drove around Salt Hill, up the steep hill of Threadneedle Road and along the promenade, where the wind skidded in off the sea. Then they went down by the Ocean Wave Hotel, home to Galway's first discos. The Ocean Wave Hotel was busy that night. Rows of cars were parked outside, all along the side of the road. PJ and Jim decided to drive slowly along the line of cars and check the number plates, on the off chance they might spot the wanted car and its drivers. PJ checked all the cars on the left-hand side, while Jim drove and examined cars on the right. At 11:15, as crowds began to leave the disco, Jim spotted it. The Ford Cortina. Registration plate SZH562. He drove on, going past the car before turning in a driveway about 100 metres away. They looked back up the street. at the rear of the most wanted car in Ireland. The two Gardaí had walkie-talkies, but they knew the frequency could be tapped into easily. Even local kids had done it. They couldn't risk radioing for backup. PJ took off to the Garda station on foot to bring more Gardaí down to the promenade. Jim stayed in the patrol car, watching the Ford Cortina. PJ wasn't gone long when Jim spotted two men leaving the hotel and heading towards the car. Jim knew this was the moment. As the men got into the car, he drove slowly towards them. Fearing the men would flee if they saw a Garda car, Jim shone the full beam headlights into their rear-view mirror, hoping to hide behind the glare. He pulled up just behind the car as it prepared to move out into the road. The car sat there, waiting for him to pass. He knew he couldn't hold them for long. He realised he had no choice but to use the walkie-talkie and call for support. For an agonising moment he sat there, with his engine running and the men waiting for him to pass. A voice over the radio replied to his call. Another Garda car had arrived behind him. Jim radioed back to tell them to pull up alongside him and grab the passenger of the parked Ford Cortina. Jim sprang from his car and went to the driver's door. He reached in and grabbed hold of the man sitting at the wheel. He asked him for his licence. The man told him he didn't have any, and that his name was David Ball. As the second patrol car arrived, Gardaí jumped out. They went to the passenger side and got hold of the person sitting there. He said his name was Roy Hall. The driver was fair-haired and short. The passenger had dark hair and was tall and well-built. Both men had English accents. When they were brought to the Garda station, the men continued to insist their names were Roy Hall and David Ball. They wouldn't answer any questions about why they were in Ireland or where they had been in recent weeks. The Gardaí at the station believed little of what they heard. At first they didn't mention Elizabeth Plunkett or Mary Duffy to the men, but they were sure the two were Shaw and Evans. Gardaí held them there overnight on a charge of driving a stolen car and alerted Garda HQ in Dublin. With the men in custody, the local Galway Gardaí wondered if Mary Duffy may still be alive. Right then, their number one concern wasn't starting an investigation to present at court. It was to do what they could to find Mary, if there was any hope. When Jeffrey Evans was searched at the station, Garda Jim Boland found cigarettes, matches, a key and a receipt for the purchase of a caravan for £330 at a site in Barna, a coastal town slightly further west than Salt Hill, right on the fringes of Connemara. Jim wondered and hoped maybe Mary was there, alive but imprisoned in the caravan. Along with colleagues, he rushed to the caravan park. They found Shaw and Evans' caravan. Mary was not there. But there in a bin, what they found was a plastic handbag. It had signs it had been burned. Inside it was a cosmetics bag and white rosary beads in a small red purse. The next day, Monday, September 27th, Garda Detective Christy Riley was walking towards Eglinton Street Garda Station in Galway City, returning there after appearing in court. A man ran towards him. Two Gardaí chased him. Christy tripped the man as he ran past, sending him to the ground. Christy and his colleagues took him to the Garda station, where Christy learned the man had asked guards in the station to let him go to the toilet, and once in there, he had locked the door before squeezing himself out through a small window. He then took off down the street before crossing paths with Christy. That man was John Shaw. That morning, a specialist group of Gardaí from Dublin arrived at the Garda station in Galway. They were the technical unit, or as they were more widely known, the murder squad. They were the elite investigators in An Garda Síochána at the time, the team sent to handle the most serious crimes, from murders and rapes to terrorism and armed robberies. In the decades to come, the methods of some of the squad would attract major controversy, particularly around their conduct during interviews of suspects, with many allegations of brutality and forced confessions. The members of the squad who were accused always denied those claims. Following the arrests of the two men in Salt Hill, they got the call to head to Galway. They began questioning the men around 11:30 a.m. on the 27th. Both insisted they knew nothing about the cases of the missing women. John Shaw said they had not been in Brittas Bay. Geoffrey Evans eventually admitted they had been in Wicklow, but not Brittas Bay. Gardaí pressed him, saying his story wasn't adding up. They asked him if he had lost something, and he told them he had lost his boots. Gardaí showed Evans the boots they had found in the woods in Wicklow and a piece of cardboard with the name Geoffrey Murphy on it. As they presented Evans with the mounting evidence, he cracked. He admitted they had abducted Elizabeth, then taken her to the woods and raped her. He insisted it was Shaw who had killed her. This was the first certainty Gardaí had. They now knew Elizabeth was dead. Evans confessed in harrowing detail what he and Shaw had done to Elizabeth. He filled page after page with a handwritten confession. The details of what Shaw and Evans did to Mary and Elizabeth are horrific. The cruelty is almost unfathomable. Much of it does not bear repeating in detail, but to gloss over it would leave us unable to understand what the women were put through and what their families have carried with them since then. In his statement, Evans detailed how he and Shaw had been driving through Brittas that evening and had been talking about how they wanted to find a woman. They saw Elizabeth leaving the pub. Shaw got out of the car while Evans drove on. They knew it would seem less threatening to have just one man in the car. Evans approached Elizabeth and asked her where she was going. She wanted to go to Dublin, she said. He offered her a lift. She got into the car. Evans drove on and stopped, and Shaw got in. He said they began messing with Elizabeth. They drove to Castletimon Woods and got out of the car. They pulled her into the trees as Elizabeth struggled. They beat her and raped her. Shaw left to move the car to the pub car park. Elizabeth asked what they were going to do with her. Evans told her they were going to let her go before raping her. When Shaw returned, the two men lay down either side of Elizabeth so she couldn't escape. Their attacks continued throughout the night. Evans returned to the pub car park the following day and fell asleep in the car until waking again at around 1:45 p.m. After getting a push start on the car from a passerby, he drove back to the forest. As soon as he arrived, he could tell something had happened to Elizabeth. John Shaw was white. Evans said, "I asked him what were wrong, and he told me that the girl were dead." Evans didn't believe him until he saw her laying on the ground of the forest, still dressed in the white slacks and Saint-Tropez top. Shaw said that she had tried to escape while he slept, and when he ran after her, he grabbed a nylon shirt belonging to Evans and used it to strangle her. They took her clothes off again and wrapped her in a sleeping bag. They stayed there in the woods for the day before dumping her body in the sea in the early hours of the next morning, just hours before the Plunkett family drove to Wicklow to start their search. Evans wrote in his confession that he was sorry. He apologised to Elizabeth's parents. He wrote that he knew how they felt. Meanwhile, in a separate interview room, John Shaw was refusing to speak. He became violent during questioning, knocking over one of his interrogators and smashing a glass cabinet. Gardaí brought him back to his cell. Throughout the night, Gardaí continued to question Geoffrey Evans about the disappearance of Mary Duffy. He repeatedly insisted he knew nothing. He said if he had killed Mary, he would admit it. He claimed he could never again have done what he and Shaw did to Elizabeth in Brittas Bay. One of the murder squad detectives who had arrived to question Shaw and Evans was Jerry O'Carroll. The Kerry man was one of the most prominent members of the Garda Technical Unit and was involved in some of the state's most high-profile cases. What follows is Garda Detective Jerry O'Carroll's recollection of events. John Shaw would later claim Gardaí assaulted him during his questioning and coerced him into making a confession. Several courts would later reject that claim. Having arrived down from Dublin earlier that day, Jerry O'Carroll had decided to sleep in the Garda station, as he couldn't find accommodation in Galway. In the early hours of the morning he went for a walk, a long one, and he thought about Mary Duffy. He got back around 2:30 in the morning. In the quiet station, he made himself a sandwich and a cup of tea and sat with his thoughts. He decided to wake John Shaw and ask him a few questions. He took Shaw out of his cell and brought him to the station's billiard rooms for a chat. Shaw had calmed since his earlier violent outburst. As they spoke, O'Carroll talked about how hard it must all have been for the families of the missing women. He asked Shaw about his childhood. Shaw had grown up in Wigan in northern England. O'Carroll realised that Shaw was Catholic. He reminded Shaw that he once made his communion and confirmation and that his parents were once proud of him. He reminded Shaw he was once an innocent young boy. Then he said, "And look at the monster you've turned into." With this, O'Carroll saw Shaw put his head in his hands and sigh. O'Carroll sensed vulnerability. He said, "We'll say a prayer for you." Then he and Shaw began to recite the rosary. As the two began the prayer, Shaw gripped O'Carroll's arm with a look of fear on his face. He cried out, telling the detective he could see the devil. A deeper look of terror then crossed his face, and he said he could see Mary Duffy. O'Carroll knew then that Mary Duffy was dead. Shaw said, "God help me, the devil made me do it. Keep him away from me." He told detectives that Jeffrey Evans had made him commit the crimes. He said he didn't want to do what he did. Shaw kept talking. He promised to tell everything. He told O'Carroll the details of their crimes, and those details were worse than the families of Mary and Elizabeth would ever have feared. The story Shaw started telling that night in that Garda station would shock the entire country and leave a mark that has never lifted, even half a century later. John Shaw said he and Jeffrey Evans had planned to kidnap and murder one woman per week for as long as they could get away with it. John Shaw made a full confession that he and Jeffrey Evans had abducted, raped and murdered Elizabeth Plunkett and Mary Duffy. He also told them that a third woman had been selected at the disco on the night they were caught. Shaw was illiterate, so he signed a statement with an X. Elsewhere in the station, Gardaí pressed Evans to confess and tell them where Mary was. He told them she was not alive. He told them Mary was in Lough Ina, in Connemara. He offered to draw a sketch for Gardaí to show them where her body was. The two men gave Gardaí confessions that matched in almost all respects, except one crucial area. They both claimed the other had killed the women. Later that morning, Gardaí put the two men into separate cars to drive back to Connemara to retrace their crime and show them where they had left Mary Duffy's remains. John Shaw sat in the back of one car, handcuffed to Garda Detective Christy Riley. Riley didn't see the men as master criminals, and he wasn't giving their apologies much weight. Riley was a detective with many years' experience. He dealt with serious crimes, but not murder, not often, not in Galway, not in those days, and never murder like this. This was different. It was something hard to name, this new shade of darkness. When he looked at Shaw, handcuffed to him in the back of that car, Christy Riley felt the man had a vicious look about him. It was something in his eyes. That morning, 5 Garda cars drove away from Galway City, like a convoy on a wretched pilgrimage into the wilderness. The city fell away behind them, and the signs of humanity grew rarer with each passing mile. They drove into Connemara and saw the land widen and rise before them. A place like this, and a crime like that, it couldn't match. The Gardaí in the cars tried to coax conversation from Shaw and Evans, hoping they might give more information. The men remained almost silent. Christy Riley told Shaw he better tell them where they could find Mary. He said he would. Then he was silent again. The road from Galway City to Lochina passed through small, quiet towns like Moycullen and Uachtarard. The Garda convoy drove along meandering narrow roads, passing simple hand-built walls with their ancient rocks blanketed in grass and thickets of brambles. The further west they went, the wider the world stretched to either side, with endless fields, bogs and lakes, and the low mountains framed it all, like prehistoric signposts, guiding them towards their terrible destination. As they got within 3 miles of Lochina, the Gardaí told John Shaw he was to direct them from there. As they neared the lake, they drove the narrow road along its shore. The water stretched to the left, the mountains rose away to the right, and they made their long, winding approach. As they drove along the edge of the lake, John Shaw lifted his head and said, "This is the place." They reached the boathouse, sitting at the edge of the lake. Mary was in there, Shaw told them, in the black water of Lochina. Christy Riley noticed no change in Shaw as he told them. Shaw and Evans then led Gardaí back out to the road, past the charred patch of grass where they burned Mary Duffy's clothes. Shaw and Evans directed the convoy to a derelict railway station about 15 miles away near Ballynahinch. They led Gardaí to a sharp turn into a long and narrow road, barely the width of a single car. The 5 cars crossed a stone bridge before they stopped at the edge of a secluded wooded area. The only sound was the gentle rhythmic flow of the river nearby. They led Gardaí up a narrow forest path going away from the road. They told the guards that this was where they had brought Mary after abducting her in Castlebar. It had been a journey of almost an hour and a half, along dark, winding country roads in the middle of the night. They had picked that spot for its isolation in the weeks before taking Mary. They had driven around looking for a place long before they drove to Castlebar that night. They had searched for somewhere they could commit their crimes without risk of being disturbed. As Gardaí searched the area, they found a patch of flattened grass and a ground sheet from a tent. There was a plastic bottle holding dregs of barley water. There was a red tartan cushion. They found a wad of tissue pressed into what looked like the shape of a mouth. Shaw and Evans gave Gardaí the detail of how they had taken Mary and what they had done to her. They told of how they had seen her leaving the phone box in Castlebar and then followed her. Shaw got out of the car and Evans drove on before he parked it up the road ahead of Mary. As Mary neared, they attacked. Shaw punched her so hard he knocked out her dental plate, the only trace of Mary left behind afterwards. They forced her into the car as she screamed and then sped off towards Galway. As they drove to western Connemara, they tied Mary up and beat her. The 2 men took turns raping her in the back seat. The journey lasted almost an hour and a half. They then arrived at their chosen place, up a forest path hidden from the road under those tall trees near the river. They dragged Mary from the car, stripped her, and raped her again. They tied her to a tree and set up their tent so they could sleep. they left Mary tied to that tree all night. The next morning, before dawn, Geoffrey Evans drove back to Barna, where they had their caravan. He slept for a few hours, and when he woke, he put a rope and a large concrete block in the car, before driving back out to Ballynahinch. While Evans was gone, John Shaw untied Mary from the tree and raped her again. He then brought Mary to the edge of the nearby river. They sat on a log near the shore, and as they did, Shaw saw a group of fishermen. Mary didn't see them. She had her back turned. She never called for help. Evans returned in the evening. He found Shaw and Mary in the tent. It was clear Shaw had beaten her. Evans offered her a cheese sandwich and a drink. Mary didn't eat. Shaw left, driving to a nearby town to go to the pub. Evans then raped her again. When Shaw got back, the two men talked about what to do with Mary. They forced her to take 5 Valium tablets. They told her they would take her home. They told Gardaí that after taking the tablets, Mary became dozy. Evans went to the car, and Shaw sat in the tent with Mary. Shaw used a red tartan cushion in an attempt to suffocate her. He then strangled and killed her. When the state pathologist later examined Mary, he found that, quote, there was a possibility of intercourse after death. Evans told Gardaí that when he went back to the tent he found Mary was dead. He said to Shaw they would have to do the same as they did in Wicklow. They put Mary's body in the car and drove to the boathouse at Lough Ina. They removed her coat, her last piece of clothing, and her 2 gold rings. They threw the rings into a field near the lake. They broke into the boathouse and stole a sledgehammer, which they tied to her waist. They tied the concrete block from the car to her legs, and then tied the grappling hook to her too. They rowed out across Lough Ina, and, with Evans trying to keep the boat steady, Shaw dropped Mary's weighted down body into the black water of the lake. Then they rowed back to the boathouse. In Wexford, on Tuesday, 28th of September, as Gardaí drove Shaw and Evans around Connemara, a man named Jack Harper was at home watching the news on television. There was a report about the case of Mary Duffy and Elizabeth Plunkett. Half an hour later, Jack headed out for a walk on Duncormick Beach in County Wexford, some 100 kilometres further south along the coast from Brittas Bay, where Elizabeth was last seen. As Jack walked along, he noticed something in a grassy area near the shoreline. News reached Dublin quickly that a body had been found. For 4 weeks, Elizabeth Plunkett's family had been tortured each day waiting for news. Elizabeth's sister Bernie was walking over the bridge in Ringsend when she saw her cousin. Her cousin shouted to her that they had found Elizabeth's body. Bernie ran home and found her family sitting in the house. She asked what was happening. It was final. Their worst fear was now real. Elizabeth was gone. That same day, Gardaí brought Shaw and Evans to Brittas Bay to have the men show them how their crime had unfolded and what they had done with Elizabeth's body. As the 2 men led Gardaí on that horrific journey around the seaside town, they admitted it all. They told Gardaí they had weighted Elizabeth's body down with a lawnmower they had stolen from a shed close to the beach. They had rowed out to sea in a small boat before dropping her in. They had then burned Elizabeth's clothes in a fire. The same fire they sat at when Garda Nicky Crennan had encountered them the day after Elizabeth went missing. That day, as he explained to Gardaí how he had raped and murdered young Elizabeth Plunkett, John Shaw asked Garda detective Jerry O'Carroll to send a birthday card to his son in England for him. Elizabeth's father Tommy and her uncle Willie went to Wexford to identify her. Then, just as they had done a month earlier when they first went to search for Elizabeth, her family drove together to Wexford to bring her home. No one spoke on the journey. The Plunkett family found their daughter and sister laying in a small chapel in Wexford Hospital mortuary. Elizabeth's body was so badly damaged by her time in the sea that the coffin was closed. The family couldn't see her. Her mother in her black coat cried and begged to see her daughter one last time. She clung to the coffin. She had to be held back. Mella, Elizabeth's best friend, asked if she could just see her hands. Elizabeth always had such immaculate nails. Mella knew she would recognise them. She wanted to make sure it was really her best friend. When the Plunkett family arrived home to Ringsend, a crowd filled the street. Their neighbours had come out to offer their support. There were so many people, the family barely had room to open the car doors. Thousands of people turned out for Elizabeth's funeral at St. Patrick's Church in Ringsend on October 1st, 1976. Kathleen, Elizabeth's mother, had to be held up by her son. The Plunkett siblings thought it was the first time any of them had seen their father cry. On October 2nd, 1976, in Dean's Grange Cemetery, Dublin, Elizabeth Plunkett was laid to rest. As the Plunketts said goodbye to Elizabeth, the Duffys waited in the hope that they would get the chance to do the same for Mary. On September 29th, the day after Elizabeth's body was found, the search for Mary in Lough Innes started. 35 divers, including Gardaí and members of the Defence Forces, along with civilian volunteers, searched the frigid, murky waters of Lough Innes. Some of those volunteers were just 21 years old. Along the shoreline, hundreds of people watched, horrified by what had happened. Standing there too was John Duffy, Mary's brother. A friend of his had volunteered to join the diving search party. John stood by the lake watching, waiting for some hope that he could bring his sister home. Also there at the lake was one of Mary's killers, John Shaw. Gardaí had brought him to the lake during the search in the hope that he could offer more precise information to aid the divers. He stood on the dock, handcuffed to Detective Christy Riley. But Shaw offered nothing more. Instead, he stood at the water's edge watching the scene, enjoying the nightmare he had created. Lough Innes is a deep lake, at parts 70 feet deep. The water was so dark with sediment, the divers couldn't see the depth gauges on their wrists. For much of it, they searched blindly with their hands. Many of the wetsuits had holes, allowing icy water to bleed in. Every day was a physical and mental trial for those divers. The water was divided into grids, and temporary buoys made of milk cartons kept ropes afloat in the water. The divers pushed a long, narrow metal bar sideways along the lake bed. They gently inched it through the sediment. Step by step, they pressed into the darkness. They went from one side of the lake to the other, and then back again. When they found something, they were to bang on the metal bar. They lived in a constant state of simmering terror, moving forward into the icy dark, knowing that somewhere there lay the remains of Mary. They all wanted Mary found, but no one wanted to be the one who found her. Between them, they spent over 400 hours searching underwater. By October 10th, after almost 2 weeks searching, they had almost given up. Doubts had begun to creep in about what Shaw and Evans had told them. The divers were reaching their physical and mental limits. Then the sound of banging on the metal bar vibrated through the water. A volunteer diver, Tommy Mulveen, raised the alarm. He had felt something, He banged on the bar. They stopped and waited to allow the sediment in the water to settle so he could get a clearer view. He saw Mary Duffy. As the water cleared, he let out a cry of shock. He saw how she had been left there, tied and weighted down. He could see her injuries. Shaw's dark hair still clutched in her hand. For some of those divers, those weeks in the cold chill of Lough Ina never fully left them. Years passed before the nightmares began, as memories resurfaced to haunt them. They would be drawn back into the icy lake and consumed again by that feeling of dread down there in the pitch black. Even decades later, that shadow had still not faded. As the full picture of these crimes emerged, it left a deep mark not only on the families of Mary and Elizabeth, but on Ireland as a whole. It would lead to Shaw and Evans becoming two of Ireland's most reviled criminals. But for one of the families, the Plunketts, living with that lifetime of pain would be compounded decades later by a shocking revelation that dragged them back to those awful memories of 1976 and forced them to fight for their sister's memory. A crowd of over 2,000 people gathered in the cold wind and rain at the Church of St. Anne in Belcarra on Tuesday the 12th of October 1976 for the funeral of Mary Duffy. Belcarra had just a few hundred residents, but many more had come from all over Mayo and beyond to pay their respects. Locals formed the guard of honour for the funeral cortege on the edge of the town and then walked with it to the church. The crowd covered every inch of ground. There was almost total silence. The crowd watched in silent respect as her friends and family carried her coffin into the church. Mourners wept as they laid wreaths. Mary's parents and her 6 siblings took their seats before the altar, with the rows behind them full. Those who couldn't fit inside stood in the churchyard. Local priest, Father Paddy McDermott, led the prayers for the young woman, with 8 other priests joining him. Throughout the crowd, there was a sense of rage over the horrific end to Mary Duffy's short life. Many wished that Shaw and Evans would be dropped off in Belcarra so that they may deliver their own justice. Mary Duffy was buried in a small graveyard in Belcarra, next to the field she had wandered and played in as a young girl. During the course of their interviews with Gardaí, John Shaw and Geoffrey Evans turned on each other, describing the other as the driving force behind the crimes. As a result of this, the High Court ruled that they should be tried separately. They also decided that the cases of Elizabeth Plunkett and Mary Duffy should be tried individually. This meant there would be 4 separate trials. After a number of delays in proceedings, the trial eventually went ahead for John Shaw for the murder of Mary Duffy. For 4 weeks, the all-male 12-person jury heard harrowing testimony from hundreds of witnesses and the shocking details in the confessions of Shaw and Evans. Mary's sister Anne, then just 14, went to Dublin for the first time for the trial, where she would testify. While in the witness box, she identified the purse found in Shaw and Evans' caravan and the mascara inside, which her sister had shared with her. The jury retired, and after 5 hours they returned. They could not reach a unanimous verdict. There was one holdout. And so the judge dismissed them. There would be a retrial with a new jury, and the family would have to sit through it all again. 6 months later, following the retrial, John Shaw was found guilty of the murder of Mary Duffy. He was jailed for life for her murder and received 14 years for rape and 2 years for false imprisonment. Next would be the trial of Geoffrey Evans. In the intervening months since Shaw's trial, the DPP had won a Supreme Court challenge which allowed them to try him for all of his crimes in one trial. That trial began in November 1978. Elizabeth Plunkett's father did his best to keep the more upsetting details revealed in the trial from his family. When he took to the witness box, he couldn't bear to look at the exhibits. His daughter's shoes, her silver watch, his gift to her on her 21st birthday. Tommy collapsed in the courtroom. When Damien Bush took the stand, he wept as he told of the last time he saw Elizabeth as she left McDaniel's pub. As the jury were about to deliberate, the judge, Mr. Justice Scannon, made a surprising decision to order an acquittal of Geoffrey Evans for the murder of Elizabeth Plunkett, following submissions made by his legal team. The reason for this decision has never been made clear. He was found guilty on all other counts, including the murder of Mary Duffy. A newspaper report from the time told that as the verdict was read, Evans leaned forward in the dock, dressed in a three-piece navy suit and wearing a grown-out crew cut, and grinned. But his smile faded soon as the judge gave him a life sentence for murder. When the two men were first sentenced, the average life sentence in Ireland was between 7 and 8 years. Today, that average is 20 years. Shaw and Evans, however, would serve far longer. On Christmas Eve 2008, Geoffrey Evans went into the Mater Hospital for a heart bypass operation. He had a stroke following the surgery, and for the next 4 years he was in a coma, with a round-the-clock guard and an electronic bracelet to prevent his escape. He died in 2012 as a result of sepsis due to hospital-acquired pneumonia. He had been imprisoned for 46 years, since that night he was arrested outside the Ocean Wave Hotel in Galway. No one came forward to claim his body, and he was buried in an unmarked grave by the Irish Prison Services. The two men had remained close in prison. John Shaw did not interact much with anyone in prison after Evans' death. He was reported to only interact with his pet budgie, who he named Geoffrey. 2026 will mark half a century behind bars for John Shaw, making him one of Ireland's longest-serving prisoners. He is one of just 3 people to have served a sentence of over 40 years. Throughout the last 50 years, Shaw has repeatedly applied for parole, but multiple justice ministers have declined his requests. In a 2017 application to the High Court to allow him some temporary release, Shaw argued he had been a model prisoner. The court heard he believed he killed Mary Duffy in, quote, as humane a way as possible. A risk assessment at the time found Shaw was a high-level risk for reoffending as well as having a deviant sexual preference. The report found he was hostile towards women and had little concern for other people. Despite these claims about his potential risk to society, in 2020, Shaw was granted 2 days of temporary release a year by then Minister for Justice Charlie Flanagan. In May 2022, John Shaw stepped foot outside of the prison walls for the first time since 1976. Together with 2 prison officers, he spent the day strolling around Dublin city, observing a much-changed world from the one he last saw. He had nobody to meet. He has only ever received 1 visitor during his decades behind bars. But he went to a cafe for a coffee. He was then taken back to prison that evening. For the families of Mary Duffy and Elizabeth Plunkett, the thought of the men responsible for the cruel and tragic deaths of their sisters being released was a heinous one. At times over the years, members of the Duffy family spoke publicly about the need to have the men remain behind bars. The Duffy family rarely spoke to media, but the Plunkett family never did. Still deeply hurt by the betrayal at the hands of the press, when pictures of Elizabeth were stolen from their home during the search for her, the family vowed never to speak publicly again. However, a shocking revelation would force them to break that silence, as they realised they needed to speak up for Elizabeth. In 2023, with John Shaw up for parole, The parole board asked the families to submit a written statement explaining how Shaw's murder of Elizabeth had impacted them. They were offered a chance to explain why they felt Shaw should remain in prison. Writing that letter was a painful experience that caused them sleepless nights. They also had a meeting with the parole board. Dragging up old memories was traumatizing. The family had spent so long trying only to remember the happy memories they had of their sister. What came next was a deep shock to them. The parole board had made a mistake. It turned out the Plunkett family were not considered by the law to be what are known as relevant victims. They were told their views on John Shaw and the impact of what he had done to them could not be taken into account. This was because neither John Shaw nor Jeffrey Evans were ever convicted of the murder of their sister. The Plunkett family was never aware of this. Both men had made full confessions and both men had stood trial. But it turned out, while they had been convicted of the murder of Mary Duffy, neither had ever been convicted of the murder of Elizabeth. This wasn't just a shock to the Plunketts. In all of the years of news reports about the murders, it had been taken as fact that both men were convicted of the murders of both women. State agencies, like the prison service, took it as fact too. And this mistaken belief carried on right up until the parole board contacted the family in 2023. At first, they also believed the Plunketts were, in the eyes of the courts, victims of Shaw's crimes. But as they looked into it, the parole board realised that in the case of Jeffrey Evans, the judge at the trial had ordered the jury to find him not guilty of the murder of Elizabeth. No reason has ever been found to explain that decision. And then, in 1979, the Director of Public Prosecutions dropped the charges against John Shaw for Elizabeth's murder. Again, so far there's been no clear explanation of why this happened. One theory is that as both men were found guilty of Mary Duffy's murder and received the maximum life sentence for it, prosecutors simply decided the expense of another trial was not necessary. No inquest was ever held into Elizabeth's death, and no death cert ever issued. Again, these were things the Plunkett family weren't aware of until recent years. This realisation for the Plunkett family was a heartbreaking and bitter one. Her family said, "It's like she never existed. It's like she didn't matter." Upset and angry, the Plunketts refused to accept they could be labelled with the term "not relevant victims." They contacted the DPP, the government and Gardaí to seek answers. They got none. And so they decided to end their vow of public silence about Elizabeth's death. They turned to the local politicians and the media to shine a spotlight on their sister's case. They approached RTE and spoke to them for a documentary podcast series called Stolen Sister. In that, they spoke publicly for the first time about their experience. It tells the story of the crimes and their impact in detail. And there the Plunkett family remembered their confident, independent and formidable sister. They told of how she would have fought for them, and so they must continue their fight for her. Although they received much public support as people heard their story, the reality now is that they face a major fight to have John Shaw face a trial for Elizabeth's murder. Almost 50 years after the crimes, hopes of a new trial are slim, although in rare cases it can happen. The family hope that if they can uncover new evidence, they might be able to get the case reopened. As part of the podcast, they asked for anyone else with information about the crimes of John Shaw to come forward. It was then that those many stories of attempted abductions around Ireland emerged, as people got in touch to tell their stories of terrifying encounters with Shaw and Evans. The Plunketts have promised to keep up their fight. Elizabeth's sister Bernie told the Irish Times last year, "They thought these two owl wands would just go away. But no, sorry, not when you're fighting for your family." In January of 2025, an inquest into Elizabeth's death at last took place. the coroner gave a verdict of unlawful killing. It was some solace, and the Plunkett family were grateful for it, but it was not enough. The loss of Elizabeth and Mary has forever reshaped their families, and its pain has never faded from those first days, months and years. On the second anniversary of Elizabeth's death, the Plunkett family posted an anniversary notice in a newspaper. It read, "A light is from our household gone, a voice we loved is still. A place is vacant in our home that never can be filled." Elizabeth's father, Tommy, died in the early 80s after a heart attack aged just 65. He had spent the years after Elizabeth's murder refusing to discuss it. Her mother, Kathleen, would lie in bed at night and tell Tommy she could hear Elizabeth calling her. Kathleen passed away less than a year after Tommy. Her last words were to her husband, who had gone before her. She said, Tommy, is that her?" Both of Elizabeth's parents were dead within 7 years of losing their daughter. The Plunkett siblings were left reeling. Shaw and Evans hadn't just taken their sister, they had killed their parents too. Outside of the Duffy and Plunkett families, the impact of these crimes left its deep mark too. From the divers who searched Lough Ina to the Gardaí who investigated them. One Garda detective who questioned Shaw and Evans was Tom Connolly. He said years later, "To this day I'm still horrified." He considered it the worst case he had ever heard of. He said, "I can't forget. I don't want to forget." Jerry O'Carroll, who heard John Shaw's confession in that Garda station in the early hours of the morning, would later say, even decades later, thinking about it all sent shivers down his spine. He would say, "Of all the criminals I dealt with in my Garda career, these two sadists are two of the most evil human beings I ever came across. They truly are the personification of evil." He called the case a landmark of horror in Ireland. For Mella Bush, Elizabeth's best friend, she spent many years plagued by dreams about what had happened to her friend and was terrified to leave the house. That fear haunted her for many years. In 2025, Mary Duffy's family put a bench at Lough Ina in her honour. They wanted somewhere that marked her memory. An inscription on it reads, "In loving memory of Mary Duffy, from the Duffy family." Beyond that, the memories of Mary live on with them, the good memories of their sister. A couple of times a month, Mary's siblings visit her grave near the family home. They spend some time with Mary and clean the grave, with its 2 pictures on the headstone. Their mother Margaret and father John together on one side, and on the other, young Mary. Elizabeth's family visit her grave in Dublin, as they have done for almost 50 years. But after many years, her sisters decided to change how they viewed those visits. They decided they would visit the grave, then take Elizabeth with them for the day. They would go for a meal together and speak about her, returning to those good memories of their wonderful, fun and courageous sister. Elizabeth's sister Kathleen, who was just 14 when she lost her older sister, keeps a memory of her close to hand every day. Elizabeth's long green leather coat still hangs in her wardrobe at home. With something like this, one of the hardest things to answer is why, or maybe how. How could humans inflict suffering like this on someone? Maybe you could go back to the lives of Shaw and Evans before they came to Ireland to search for hints of a reason. Maybe you could put it down to that unknowable quantity of someone just being evil. It's impossible to know. As Detective Tom Connolly once said in an interview, "Is evil even the word?" I think not being able to understand that is why we can never forget crimes like these. They affect us in ways far deeper than anything we can put a label on. Because if we can't understand them, we can't protect against them. Some of Elizabeth's friends who were with her in Brittas on the night she went missing spoke afterwards of their feelings of guilt, that they could have done something differently and it would never have happened. But there is no reason or logic to something like this. There is no way to make sense of it. Ultimately, does it matter? Does anything matter beyond the suffering those men caused? The only solace is in the acts that came after it. From the Gardaí who investigated it, to the divers in Lough Ina, to the families and friends of Elizabeth and Mary who have never let their memories fade. That is the good, and it spreads far wider than the evil. Thank you for listening to this episode of Lines of Enquiry. If you have been affected by any of the topics covered in this episode, you can contact the Dublin Rape Crisis Centre on their 24/7 helpline at 1800 77 8888. That is a national helpline available to anyone in Ireland. It is confidential support for anyone who has been raped, sexually assaulted, sexually harassed, or sexually abused at any time in their lives. We have set up an Instagram page. If you're there, please give us a follow at Lines of Enquiry Podcast. We have an email address, linesofenquiry@goloudnow.com, and we would love to hear from you, so get in touch. Whether you have a story you think we should cover, or just want to let us know how you felt about an episode. That email is linesofenquiry@goloudnow.com. If you're enjoying the podcast, leaving a rating or review really helps. We've now passed 3,000 5-star ratings on Spotify, with a growing number of reviews on Apple Podcasts. Those responses make a real difference. They help new listeners find the series, and I am genuinely humbled by the response we've gotten. Thank you. Your support helps us to tell these stories. Make sure to like or follow the podcast in your podcast app and hit the notifications button so you'll know every time a new episode is released. Lines of Enquiry is presented by me, John Sweetman. The podcast is created by Darren Cleary. Our executive producer is Owen Brennan. Our producers are Siobhan Maguire and Siobhan Walsh. Sound editing and design is by Neil Kavanagh, with additional editing support from Ed Smith. This episode was written by Siobhan Walsh and Owen Brennan. Social media, marketing, video, and legal support comes from the GoLoud team. In the end, everything done in the dark comes to light.